Hello, and welcome to Taking Liberties. This week we've got Kieran, Lara, and myself, Austen. We'll be talking about some interesting stuff this week. We've got some libertarian brutalism. We've got some housing, public housing to talk about. And we'll be finishing that up with open borders. So I'll start the show. I'll be talking about libertarian brutalism. And what that is a concept that was written about by Jeffrey Tucker in a recent article for the Foundation for Economic Education. And he talks about brutalist libertarianism as opposed to a more broad, sort of happier libertarianism. And a lot of people have commented on this this piece. Some people saw it as an attack on particular philosophers in the libertarian movement, such as Hoppe. Some people saw it as an attack on objectivism. Some people, including myself, thinks it's more along the lines of thin versus thick libertarianism. But it's definitely sparked a lot of debate with most of the people I've seen really, really strongly loving it, and a few people really hating it. And so what Tucker defines as libertarian brutalism is essentially the concept that as long as we have property rights, as long as we get rid of government to an extent that we just have our property rights, everything else will work itself out, and there's nothing else we need to do. That, in fact, we should be fine with racist, sexist, homophobic enclaves sort of springing up and excluding people, and there's no sort of social pressure we need to worry about doing that. As long as we get our property rights, everything will be hunky-dory. And he contrasts that with sort of the more broad, yes, we need freedom from government, but we should also be fighting for social justice, for sort of progressive ideals in the social sense. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make, because while we do, as libertarians, need to tolerate people having opinions we disagree with, maybe aberrant ones, that does not mean we need to approve of them. And I think that's the big point he's trying to make. And I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I think the big thing that I took from it is the idea that what he terms libertarian brutalists, people who strip the ideology back to its very core, that the reason they do that is to form an intellectual justification for being bigoted. As part of it's almost like they're arguing for free speech because they want to be racist, as opposed to arguing for free speech because free speech will be, will lead to a more robust and informed public debate, for example. So I think that idea, and I think the other one that he mentions is the idea that you might create this, this enclave. You might have a homophobic village or community of some kind, and it seems to me that he's really calling people out for basically justifying or that's the conclusion they want to drive towards. And then libertarianism is a justification for that, rather than an idea that either libertarianism is good and it will lead to good things, or having, and this is what I think he argues for in the humanist approach, we want people to have good, fulfilling lives, therefore libertarianism.
I think what I liked most about the piece was the way it didn't shy away from the question of how we present libertarianism. The point that kind of sat the strongest with me was, I'm going to find this quote, "You can only really appreciate the results of brutalism, however, if you have already bought into the theory and believe in it. Otherwise, absent the extremist and fundamentalist ideology, the building," talking about brutalist architecture, "comes across as terrifying and threatening." And he goes on to make the point that libertarian brutalism is, similar to architectural brutalism in that way, and of course sits opposed to libertarian humanitarianism, which is significantly more accessible an idea, a much more peaceful idea, and gels more with the kind of generally progressive ideals of society, and makes it a much easier ideology to market and to share with people and to engage people with, because it doesn't kind of give you this state of nature view of a libertarian world. And I think that's really true.
Yeah, I'd say the actual distinction is one of the biggest things that people see when they see libertarianism is they see the brutalist fringe, and they tend to mischaracterize the entire movement based on those very few people, fortunately very few people, who are louder but have these sort of obnoxious views that, well, as libertarians, we are sort of compelled to say, yes, you can believe that, and yes, there would be nothing stopping you from, say, denying people who you didn't like the look of coming into your shop, but that doesn't mean that we like it. That doesn't mean that we would be willing to deal with you, and it certainly doesn't mean that that's what the philosophy is about. That toleration is not approval. Or sorry, it's not even toleration really. It's allowing, not coming in with guns and stopping you from doing something is not the same as tolerating something, and it's certainly not the same as approving of something.
It might be the same as tolerating something, but you're right. I mean, there is a place in libertarianism for that kind of ideology, as much as we don't want to admit it, and that is one of the fundamental problems that occurs when you come to try to market libertarianism. I think there is an argument that you can make against it, that libertarianism is a purely political philosophy, and that the brutalist/humanitarian question is a question of social ideology, and just about any social ideology can connect with libertarianism in a pretty satisfactory way. And this is, it becomes a problem when social ideologies that you don't like, such as, the example of a homophobic town or a racist community, are brought up. But the reality is that in Libertopia, all of these things would be kind of possible. Now, I think it is important to push humanitarianism as much as you can, but especially talking amongst ourselves, it's important to acknowledge that that part of it is always, that sort of scarier and more distasteful part of libertarianism is always going to be there. And it's something that we have to be aware of and be on guard about.
Well, and also, though, the question is not whether or not these sorts of bad ideology can exist in libertarian society, because they exist in any society. The fact is, you can't legislate away bad beliefs as much as governments try to. You can't get rid of these beliefs, and yes, you can push them underground to a certain extent, and you can make people superficially comply, but that doesn't make these bad ideas go away. In fact, what it does is it hides them in shadow, and effectively we don't see them as much as we would. And traditionally, people of these sort of like bigoted viewpoints will use government as a tool to advance their views. And that certainly I have more of a problem with that than I do with the person who says, well, I want to go off and live in a village where everybody has red hair and drinks Coca-Cola and not tolerate anyone else coming in my thing. And someone says, well, I want to take over government and I want to send everyone who doesn't have red hair and drink Coca-Cola off to the death camp. That, well, both are somewhat offensive. One of them is far more scary to me, and that's the one that uses the power of the state to enforce those beliefs.
So I think I'd probably take a stronger line than either of you on this. I would actually go as far as to say that in the extreme case, particularly at the fringe of these brutalist beliefs, I genuinely don't see these people as libertarians. I think that the level of bigotry that's involved is actually impossible to meaningfully reconcile with libertarianism. The idea, to take your example, that you might go off and you might set up a village where you don't let in non-redheads and non-Coca-Cola drinkers. The situation you're talking about there is they're going off and they're forming a pro-redhead, pro-Coca-Cola government in that village. This isn't a case of escaping the state. This is a case of escaping a state, a larger state. It's a case of them escaping a state which doesn't let them do this, but it's a case of them creating a new quasi-state that allows them to fully express their bigoted beliefs and to force those upon the people who live in that village and people who are born in that village. It's not a case that you choose where you're born. You're born into this this redhead Coca-Cola drinking loving Coca-Cola loving village, and you're now having this forced upon you. I don't think that's libertarian. I think that, and if Vickers was here, he'd accuse me of engaging in libertarian policing. But I think that our movement desperately needs that. We need to be pushing back against these sort of neo-Nazis that latch onto it as a justification, which is certainly more palatable than what they had to begin with. But they're dragging us into that mess.
Well, look, I'll be honest. I think that it's fair to say that hypothetical village is a problem. The question is, what is the solution? Is the solution legislation? Or is the solution speech, socialization, and allowing people to exit freely from that community?
So, I think the problem there is... So, with that village, we have, that independent enclave, etc. There's nothing that says that they have to let people freely exit. Once you've stripped away government and the rest of us, it's an argument about, do we now actually libertarian, or let's call it ourselves the nice village? Do we take guns and force them to let people out of their nasty village?
I think that would be totally consistent with libertarianism, especially if we charge the people we rescue afterwards.
But I think that's probably a really interesting segue into open borders.
Absolutely.
And the importance there, because having open borders is the ultimate expression of voting with your feet. It's being able to say, I dislike the society that I'm in for some reason, and I want to move to another society which I like more. And I think one of the reasons to sort of harp onto open borders today is that last weekend, I think it would have been, what was the date? The 16th, I think, was International Open Borders Day.
Woohoo!
Which is a pretty new feature on the calendar. I don't think it's on the United Nations official calendar by any measure. But
No.
there's what I would like to think of as a
right to vacation, not a right to travel where you want to. Get it correct.
So Open Borders Day is a day for celebrating the world which free migration has created, for looking at countries like the United States, looking at countries like, to a lesser extent, Australia, that free migration, or at least much freer migration, has created. And it's a day for looking at the ways that we're actually erecting more barriers, looking at how much we are quite explicitly saying, you human being who was born over there has less entitlement to happiness than you human being who was born over here. You can access different things in your life. You from over there can never move over here, or can only move in very strict situations. I think Open Borders Day is just a day for publicizing and talking about the benefits of radically freer migration. What do you guys think?
Well, I certainly love the idea of open borders. Some of you may know that my retirement plan delves pretty heavily into getting away from state authority by way of international waters / land ownership and possibly some bribes. So over the course of a lifetime, it's an issue that'll interest me quite a bit. I suppose the biggest concern that I've come up against when I talk to people about open borders isn't the concept. I think conceptually it's a very nice idea. It's very easy to wrap your head around. But the big issue I've come up against, and I'd love to get you guys' perspective on this, is what happens if you're the first mover? Are you going to experience the first mover advantage in such a way that it's going to be a huge benefit to your economy? Is it going to lead to a kind of snowball effect of nations around you, or are you just going to get swamped by people whose lives are not working out in their current situation?
Well, I think that's actually one of the benefits of supporting open borders. And that you hear a lot of people say something along the lines that we can't have open borders in a welfare state. And I said, well, no, but if you open borders, that puts strong pressure to minimize or dismantle a welfare state, because you effectively allow for competition between regimes. And that, yes, well, at the same time as you might have more people coming in to get welfare, you would also then have capital, if they don't like being taxed, to pay for the welfare of these people leaving. So you would see a long-term equilibrization. It's a hard word. Equilibrization. Is that a word at all?
I don't think so. Equilibrium.
Thank you. But the point is, you will see then smart regimes will change their policy to reflect this, and regimes that don't will eventually fail. You can see this to some degree within the states in the United States, that there's tends to be a lot of movement between them because they have open borders, and you'll see people moving towards states with low taxes, and you'll see other types of people moving towards states with high welfare schemes, and those two do not tend to be the same states. And I think that is, and I don't know the actual stats on this, but it seems to be leading towards the fact you see states with hefty welfare systems going further and further into deficit and debt, and states that lack those schemes and also lack the taxes tending to be a lot better in terms of their state fiscal situation.
Yeah,
and you can extrapolate it to a global sense as well.
You're 100% right. The US is a very, very, very good example of that. And I think from memory, it's the lower taxes, as you said, that have a much, much higher impact on the flow of capital between states. I mean, there were incidents recently, actually, I might be going back about a year for this, but there was a good story about a pro-golfer moving from California to Florida to keep the tropical lifestyle but avoid the absolutely obscene tax burden that was about to be charged at the local level, because California has been broke for a long time, has been very, very broke, is going through a very tough time. So that's kind of an extreme end example. He, is a millionaire, and not all of us will be that lucky. But hopefully, as we see that, that states and areas of government that are practicing more liberal policy will continue to succeed as a result, and it'll be easier for everyone else to do the same.
So I think actually just a couple of weeks ago, Salma Hayek and her husband actually moved out of France, moved to London to escape the 75% super tax there.
Isn't that obscene?
So I think you're right that open borders increases what we might call tax competition or regulation competition between states, and I think that it drives that in what I would think is a really good direction. It drives taxes down.
Mm-hmm.
Just like companies move their assets around and their operations around to find good attractive tax rates at the moment, I think that we'd see some of that at the more individual level, but I think that we shouldn't overplay that, because people have, the transaction cost and the search cost for moving country is very high. I don't think that we'll see regular people flicking backwards and forwards between different countries. I think we'll see people making decisions based on a whole basket of reasons and their best guesses about the future, and we'll see them moving once or twice in their lives.
Well, Kieran, I think that's a good point, but if you look at the current state, we've got all these barriers to immigration now. So if tomorrow, say, I snap my fingers and all immigration and immigration restrictions were gone, you would see an initial period of huge migration. Because right now, the current distribution of people is not consistent with the preferences of people living where they want to live. There are these artificial barriers up. So yes, well, I think near equilibrium, you would see something like that I don't think there would be a huge amount of cross-migration. But in the near future, if you got rid of it, you would see an enormous amount of that. And just to play devil's advocate, because I think we agree too much on this issue, there's a common argument I hear is that you also have a danger of allowing people into a democracy, because every new person you bring in effectively gets one share of you. That they have eventually a process to get citizenship and get the vote, and gradually, let's say there was Communistan or something where everyone was a hardcore communist, and they said, well, this is fine, but we really want to share the loveliness of communism with Australia, so we're all going to move there because they have open borders now, and then we're going to become citizens, and then we're going to vote, and we're going to make it a communist utopia just like us. And I could see that being a potential argument against open borders. What do you guys think about that?
Well, the flip side of that, obviously, is the Free State Project in New Hampshire, which is exactly that plan, which is we love our lifestyles and we want to share it with a geographic location. But in this case, it's a love of freedom. So, yeah, the Free State Project is basically an online group of people, or an online network looking for people to move to New Hampshire, about 20,000 of them, on the premise that they will advance liberty, whether that's through their careers, through their personal lives, through their voting habits. So, when you... I guess there's no cure for that. It is spontaneous order. There's nothing that really can be done to prevent that under the current system or under a system of open borders. But it's probably... I think it's not necessarily a bad thing if you have people moving to locations on the basis of correlating locations with interests and cultural lifestyles. You have really strong free market, essentially, for culture. And I think having competing cultures and competing markets is, on the whole, going to be a very, very good thing for humanity.
So I was actually going to jump in, and I think we're a little bit had the same thought there. And the Free State Project occurred to me as well. But actually, as a reason that we shouldn't worry about this. So the Free State Project started in 2001, so it's been running for 12, 13 years now. Their target was to sign up 20,000 people. They've ended up with about 15,000 people signing a statement of intent to move, and about 1,500 people who have actually moved. It's not a huge number. There's no immigration restrictions within the United States. There's nothing stopping people moving from the other 50 states into New Hampshire, into this place, and there's nothing then stopping them running for office and all of that. But very, very small numbers have, and I think in 2012 they had about a dozen free staters were elected to the New Hampshire House of Representatives, which sounds like a lot, except there's 400 members in the House there.
Right,
so,
but relative to 1,500 people moving, it's a good effort.
Yeah, but in over 10 years of effort, they've achieved 3% of the legislature.
And I think there's two things to draw from the Free State Project. The first is that the United States is close to equilibrium, that they've had open borders for hundreds of years. That's not a huge surprise to me that immigration will be slightly lower than it would be than, say, if you got rid of the borders between North and South Korea tomorrow. Then you'd see a high exflow of people. But the other thing is, I think a project like this is going to resemble some form of exponential growth, that it will be very slow to get off because people will not want to jump on until it starts working. But it will, if it reaches a critical mass, you would then, I expect, see a huge amount of increase after that point. Now, whether or not a state jurisdiction can make its laws free enough that it will attract many people, because let's say you got rid of the state of New Hampshire, you said this is a lawless area, federal law still applies, and a lot of issues still are embedded in federal law. So it isn't a panacea. But so I think that the movement of people does transition well into our third project. But just real quick, I would ask everyone, if we were to have a free state project in Australia, totally hypothetically, which state or territory should we choose, and why in one sentence?
Northern Territory, because no one's paying attention to what actually happens out there, which is just as good as having not a lot of law.
I think what the interesting one here is the accidental one that Australia already has in Byron Bay, which has a radically different culture to the rest of New South Wales and pursues some reasonably, in my opinion, strange policies like not fluoridating their water.
Oh,
And
yeah, that's right.
they have also the lowest vaccination rates in the country. If you want to, if you're, that there's a
If you're a
not
bug
a free
chaser
state
looking
I
to
would
pick up a
move to.
bad case of measles.
Not a free state I would move to, but if you don't really like your teeth or your and you love measles and you have a pretty liberal approach to drug use and tie-dyeing, then there is a free state in Australia you can move to.
It's already here. Well, my answer is Tasmania.
Is it because it's an island?
It's because no, it's because it's an island, but it's also because they get way too many senators and overrepresentation in the House as well, I believe. So that if we're going to take over one state, we may as well get one that gives us a disproportional influence on federal politics as well. So that's my answer. All right, so
no, I've got to give you this one. It really, in all seriousness, would have to be Western Australia, because Western Australia will thank you for it. They also have all of the uranium / all of the other rocks in the ground that we want.
So we can make ourselves a nuclear power pretty quickly.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so from nuclear bombs to housing projects, I don't have a good transition for that. So I'll just say, Lara, take over.
Slightly less deadly, but equally depressing. The big news of the day today is, as most of our New South Welsh listeners would be aware, and possibly listeners elsewhere, the news of the day is that the notorious housing project in, I don't even know what they call that area. I'm going to call it next to the bridge. I think Dawson's Point might also be acceptable. Beautiful location, so very, very close to the river and the CBD, excellent views of the Harbour Bridge. Essentially, the potential for a multi-billion-dollar development in that area exists quite strongly, but it's taken up with public housing. So I think it's an interesting topic. I think it's an interesting incident to look at the way that we think about and the way that we practice public housing in Australia, because we have a very long federal tradition of basically building homes and then giving them to people, which we practice to this day. But in some ways we've gotten a lot better at it, because instead of simply building out in the suburbs, we maintain properties in inner areas so that you don't ghettoize people who have sought the assistance of the state with their living situation. So, yeah, I personally, I think it's a pragmatic question about how you can kind of look after people and provide the safety net for the maximum number of people or for the maximum benefit. And in this situation, I think it's the right choice. I think that when you are dealing with a property whose land value is so high, so very, very high, like hundreds of millions of dollars without breaking a sweat, it's a no-brainer that you would destroy the unbelievably unattractive building that's presently there, rehouse the various tenants who need rehousing, and put that money towards either improving public housing services, back into general revenue to provide any other kind of service, or my preferred option, back to people in tax cuts.
So I think one of the interesting sort of parts for me is that when you do knock down these buildings and you put something else in there, newer, larger, etc., one of the things that you see here in Canberra is a certain percentage of that building being set aside for low-income housing. So you might say, so we have in Canberra quite a lot of public housing on, for Canberra, very high-value land. It doesn't have a view of Harbour Bridge, but it's pretty central. So the approach here has tended to be setting aside a proportion of a development and saying this proportion is low-income housing, the government providing some subsidies, etc., into that mix, and then you have that, you get obviously the windfall benefit of selling the land and opening it up for development, but you maintain some public housing in the area, and you avoid the problem of shifting people out into the suburbs. When you demolish with public housing, you really only have two choices. You have large, project-like developments. You see those particularly in some cities in the US. You see it in large parts of the UK.
Got a handful in Sydney.
Surrey Hills is probably an example in Sydney. You create either these large ghettos, and you might, when you first build them out in the suburbs or out in an undesirable area, and then later cities expand, those become more desirable, you knock them down, and then you build another one further out, and you create these ghettos, or you try and find a way to spread the public housing around so that you don't create ghettos. And yeah, there's pros and cons, I think, to both approaches, but the movement in Canberra has been towards knocking down large public housing developments and moving towards sort of proportions of private developments being set aside for low-income earners.
I suppose it wouldn't be a big surprise to either of you that I don't think there should be a government solution. And in fact, that if we want to accomplish the goal of getting more people in housing, which I think is a very laudable goal, the best way to do it, if we have government intervention, is to offer some form of first-time home buyer subsidy. We want people to buy homes, or offering some sort of rent support and allowing people to choose where they want to apply that, whether they want to apply it into a more expensive urban home, because there's a reason these properties are more valuable in the city, or if they would rather take it out to a cheaper suburban home or an even cheaper rural home. I think that's a choice that everyone should be allowed to make and encouraged to make to do what works best for them. And in fact, we should be also getting rid of the sort of zoning restrictions, and I know this is unpopular, building codes that force people to effectively build high-income housing. That the cost of building a skyscraper is expensive enough until you, especially without adding on the cost of getting the correct permitting, getting the correct zoning, make sure everything is compliant with whatever. I don't know. I'm not an architect. I assume we need to have like ducts and stuff and things and God, fucking hell, I can't talk about this, but I'm sure there's an added cost to that, and that makes housing more expensive.
Yes.
I think the biggest, yes, there are a set of costs there, and you have to have fire escapes and things like that, and I probably wouldn't argue against those. The real cost that you get is when the planning laws prevent you from building taller buildings.
Yes.
They prevent you from building smaller apartments. They mandate large numbers of car parks. They do all of these kind of things which reduce the number of dwellings that can be built in a given footprint of land. When you build a taller building, or when you let more apartments be packed in more densely, you decrease the cost per apartment and you make it more affordable for people. I think that's for me the biggest thing that government could do to free up. Not free up's the wrong word. It's the biggest thing government could do to increase the available housing stock and decrease prices.
Another thing they could do, just to quickly add on to that list, and I know they can't, but it's worth bringing up anyway, is weighting more lightly the concerns of neighbours. So particularly, I don't see this so much in New South Wales. In New South Wales, people are frequently happy for things to be built near where they live, which is something I rejoice in. But in Perth, it's very much not the same, and we have a very strong NIMBY attitude. And when I say NIMBY, that's an acronym which stands for Not in My Backyard. The idea is basically that they're quite happy for things to be built, but nowhere near me. And so these are the kind of people who will sort of found a bit of a pop-up community group and do a quick whip round on the block to get signatures to have, someone's new story not permitted by the council, or have an apartment block, particularly apartment blocks are the problem, not developed by the council. And this is one of the things that's really holding a lot of areas back in terms of increasing their density.
Yeah, so I think I don't want to say legitimate, but the understandable sentiment that these groups are representing is they're trying to protect their own investment. You've purchased a house in an area and it cost you $500,000. Cue rising property prices, it's now worth $1 million. But if someone down the street builds an apartment block and they sell all of their apartments for $500,000, maybe the value of your house falls to $750K. All of the arguments about characteristic of the neighborhood and suitability of the development to local community, in my mind, they all boil down to this pretty base desire of people to protect their investment. And there is a part of me that's sympathetic to that. You've made a serious long-term investment in an area based on an understanding that the area will exist in some way, and you can argue sovereign risk even around that. But I think in balancing those concerns, we need to be mindful that that we don't, as a society or as government, we don't guarantee that an area will always be zoned in a particular way. We don't guarantee that your property price will always rise. These things they assume, we don't guarantee.
Well, and the extent that is desirable, I'm sure you could come up with clever contracts that would maintain that in a community area. That if really everyone wanted to say this is a no commercial zone or something, or we don't want anyone to build above 4 stories, you could get everyone to say, well, let's all sign a contract saying that anytime someone sells their house, they sell with the condition that you won't build above a certain level. And that, there's precedence for this in housing associations, that you're not allowed to do certain things without approval of the board. And I don't see why this couldn't be extended to a community level either.
Yeah, the problem I have is not so much with people trying to make decisions about their local area. It's with the kind of building up of council as this single arbiter over what can be built and where, through the power of zoning laws, but also through the power of community lobbying. And by having that power solidified in that one body, it gives them what I think is too much control over the character of individual geographic areas.
I think, for my part, I have a philosophical attraction to councils. They're the closest level of government to citizens. They have the greatest connection to citizens, and notionally they should be best placed to be accountable and make better decisions. But the uncomfortable reality of local government is that it's largely the least professional tier of government, and doing the worst job of administration. And I think that's, this sort of touches on part of it. And I seem to recall in New South Wales that there's been some rule changes which allow the state government to override councils on zoning issues, things like that, to try and address that NIMBY issue and that what's the regulatory capture side of things as well. Because you see this as well, not just in residential developments, but commercial developments. Part of the reason that Coles and Woolworths are able to maintain, I won't say duopoly, but a dominant market position, is that local government has allowed them to lock up the sites that they might otherwise, that competitors might otherwise use.
Absolutely. And I think the bottom line is we should allow Costco to build a store in Woolloomooloo, and I think none of us would oppose that.
Costco everywhere.
Costco everywhere.
Costco apartment building complex.
Oh my God, yes.
Yes, in our Free State project, every building will have a Costco on the ground floor.
I want to live in a Costco container.
So we'll start a petition and we'll start organising to move to Perth and capture a local council so that we can build a Costco apartment building complex.
Well, it's the West. We can always just secede.
And ultimately, our Costco apartment complex can secede, but it will not be It will not feature brutalist architecture. Take a strong stand on that point.
Ayn Rand might have something to say about that.
No, okay. Ayn Rand did not support brutalist architecture. I was going to finish it up, but this is...
Now the hands are raised. I've spoken ill of Ayn Rand. And Austen is getting fired up. Okay.
You didn't speak ill of her, you spoke incorrectly of her, which are often coincidental, but not necessarily. No. Look, Ayn Rand supported an early modernist sort of internationalist style of architecture. She liked the sort of Frank Lloyd Wright large structures with lots of glass, lots of open spaces, and beauty was a big thing about architectural design for her. Brutalism actually evolved as a response to that sort of openness and beauty and said, no, a building should just be a building. Beauty is a waste, effectively. So it's more associated with communist bloc style buildings and certainly not associated with the architecture endorsed by Ayn Rand. Howard Roark is my hero. That's all we have time for this week. And I think on that note, I'll leave you until next time. We're taking liberties.
Good night.
And that's our show for now. We've had a lot of fun, taken a lot of liberties. If you've enjoyed this show, you'll be happy to know that we are looking at expanding our time slot and having a Q&A session, which we will be calling Am I Being Detained? Stay tuned to hear more about this in the upcoming weeks on our Facebook page.